the way this happened to have Delton here today came from, first of all, how many have read Ministry for the Future? Awesome book, highly recommend. I read it a couple years ago and raved about it so much, continue to, that about, I think last spring, a friend of mine in the UK who had heard me ramble on about this book, you really have to read it, she said, you know, that book that you told me about and that carbon currency thing, I heard this podcast, this is in May, I think, she's like, I heard this podcast with the author of the book and Kate Rayworth, we know Kate Rayworth of Donut Economics fame, and Delton Chen, the author of the Chen papers, which are referenced in the book all the time. And I said, wait, he's a real person? This is science fiction. I thought it was made up. So she told me about the podcast. I listened to it. As I'm listening to it, I get on LinkedIn. I connect. He writes right back, and I say, hey, I really dig what you're doing. I teach at this MBA program. Would you be interested in talking to us? And here he is today, live from Australia. The power of networking, people. So don't be afraid to reach out. Okay. That was my teachable moment. I am so happy to invite and bring Delton here to you. He is a thought leader in public policy and economic theory, and yet not an economist. He has a PhD in engineering from the University of Queensland in Australia. He did his doctoral research in hydrology of the Coral Key and Great Barrier Reef, and has studied things like groundwater management, environmental impact assessment, geothermal energy and climate mitigation policy, and yet he is here to talk to us today about a financial and accounting topic, which is really exciting. He has since created the global carbon reward, which he's going to tell us about today, which is really a revolutionary idea that is outlined beautifully in Ministry for the Future and gives us a glimpse into what it could actually look like. But we're going to hear it straight from Delton himself. So I will hand it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Janice, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bard College, for inviting me. As you can tell from my accent, I'm obviously Australian, and because I live in Australia, most of my presentations are actually done through Zoom. So I've done maybe 20 or so presentations to universities and other groups. This is actually the very first live presentation to students on the Global Carbon Reward. I'm actually an interdisciplinary analyst. That's what I call myself. As Janice said, I'm not a trained economist, so buyer beware. I'm going to present some hypotheses. This presentation actually has 40 slides, and we're going to go through the introduction pretty quickly. I'll give some context with the climate problem. Then we'll focus on what are carbon rewards, why use carbon rewards, and then the financial mechanism. If we have time, we'll talk about a policy demonstration. So, introduction. As you've already heard, the Ministry for the Future. Stan is a science fiction writer, Stan Robinson, and he actually read one of my papers or two of my papers and decided to include it in his novel as the plot structure. So if you haven't read this book, it's quite special in the way that it portrays the near-term future with climate change and the kind of suffering that might unfold. He starts the book with a story about a wet bulb temperature event, potentially hundreds of thousands of people dying, so it's pretty gruesome. Important in this novel, though, is the way it develops characters and it unfolds a new economic concept that is used to resolve the crisis at the level of the UN. If you do read the book, you'll notice that there's a reference to the Chen papers. That's me, I'm Chen. And I did help with the review of the manuscript, but the actual policy in the novel, although it's generally correct, it doesn't really portray the depth of thinking into the policy and the systems theory behind it. So I'm going to elaborate on that today. Okay, theory of change. The point I want to make about the global carbon reward is it's founded on a positive theory. So the difference is a normative theory is when people generally give their opinion-based arguments, say political rhetoric, moral stories, good examples are Greta Thunberg, Pope Francis. Normative theories, in my opinion, tend to bifurcate into optimism and pessimism. So people who are very pessimistic, they tend to become doomers or even existential nihilists. You could find your own examples. However, here what I'm saying is that I believe that this narrative, the normative narrative, has dominated climate change because carbon taxes and standard policies aren't working. And my argument is that we're stuck in a normative narrative which is undermining our ability to resolve the crisis. So what I'm going to present is a positive theory where instead of optimism and pessimism, I argue we need to look at cause and effect and consider the problem in terms of low risk or high risk. So to give context, I'm going to summarise the climate problem very, very quickly. Actually, it's not really a summary, it's more of a series of observations, but we just had Climate Week in New York. That's actually why I'm on the East Coast as well as coming here. And it's a pretty crazy week in New York, but by and large, the general consensus is that we're going to pass 1.5 degrees of global warming in the next 5 or 10 years. Climate finance is not scaling to meet the Paris goals. And the narrative is generally more critical of the fossil fuel sector now that we see we're failing to meet the 1.5 to 2 degree goal. Ironically, just after Climate Week, there was a flood in New York, very likely driven by global warming as an extreme event, unusual event. Over 8 inches of rain at JFK Airport, and Brooklyn had 7 inches. I wasn't here then. I left New York, fortunately, before then. And since we're here in the US, you probably have noticed that there are quite a lot of extreme weather events in recent years or decades. 2023 so far has been the most expensive year for extreme weather in the US, with a record of 23 events exceeding costs of $1 billion. And of course, you would have heard of the Hawaiian firestorm, which was really quite unusual. There are a lot of tornadoes and storms running through central US because of the way that the warm air moves north and meets the cold air from, the warm air from the Gulf of Mexico moves north and meets the cold air from the Arctic. So that kind of explains all the energetic storms in the middle of the country, and then you had Hurricane Idalia. From a global perspective, we also need to take note that the US isn't the whole world. We tend to hear a lot more about the US because of the mainstream media, but NASA has confirmed that this year will be the hottest on record. James Hansen, famous American scientist, he has a paper in review where he makes the claim that the science community has probably underestimated the sensitivity of the climate system to greenhouse gases. So his reasoning is that he and his colleagues analysed the effect of sulfate emissions from shipping on cloud dynamics, and he believes that those sulfate emissions and cloud effects have been masking global warming. So he anticipates much more rapid warming over the next 10 years or so to possibly exceed what most people thought was possible. Nature Communications, here's an article about warning of a forthcoming collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. Of course, that's where the heat moves through the Atlantic to the north from the Gulf of Mexico. And what's interesting about that article is that it purports that quite possibly that system could become unstable even by mid-century. Nobody really knows, of course, but this is interesting, or actually alarming, because it suggests that we're underestimating the possibility of tipping points this century. So here's a list of possible tipping points. Before they tip, they're called tipping elements. You would have heard of them: the Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet, North Atlantic ocean circulation, just mentioned. Coral reef die-off in low latitudes. So in Australia, we have extensive bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, and coral reefs and warm waters are likely to be bleached at around 1.5 degrees. That's a global problem. Thawing of permafrost and abrupt sea ice loss in the Barents Sea, all of which are global impacts. And so Climate change is not the only issue. There are other processes and systems that are important too. For example, the planetary boundaries that Rockstrom and et al. Have put forward over the years. And what they claim is that 6 of the 9 boundaries have crossed the unsustainable barrier, which they call a planetary boundary. It's a bit subjective, but I think it's a good empirical way to describe our global sustainability problem. And finally, the UN General Assembly held their meetings in New York, of course, and at those meetings, Antonio Guterres said that global governance was stuck in time. He argues that we need new multilateral institutions. Old systems don't seem to be working in responding to these crises, global crises. So in response, there's some rhetoric around accelerating the SDGs and a court ruling on climate change. Another point, in the media, if you've noticed, if you're watching the news about carbon markets, there's considerable controversy over carbon offsetting, significant cases of greenwashing and suspect carbon credits. And this problem is actually very significant. The Guardian journalists argue that more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets were probably not reliable. So, in summary, this is the interpretation I provide. You may or may not agree, but what I'm saying is that we are experiencing a slow boil problem of global warming and climate change policies. We need trillions of dollars or more targeted to decarbonisation and sustainability and a new model for global governance. But the frogs in the pot are saying, well, what about carbon offsetting and green growth? That's a story which is no longer holding together. So what are the options? The slow boil problem, I'll just summarise it for us. Carbon pricing is insufficient by an order of magnitude or more. Public funding for the clean energy transition is insufficient. Commercial and development banks create the fiat suppliers' loans, whereby lending and interest rate charges reflect ability to pay risk and collateral. So this is a key problem, that our economy is structured to support businesses that are profitable, when climate mitigation isn't necessarily. So private investors have a fiduciary duty to focus on profitability, including cost of capital. This is true for renewable energy projects in particular, very large initial investments. So they're very sensitive to the cost of loans, for example. And they also have to take into account political and fiscal uncertainty over subsidies and policies. Developing nations have relatively high borrowing costs, debt levels and climate costs. This is a big issue for African nations, for example. Fossil fuel projects may be protected through trade treaties. There's examples in Canada. Fossil fuel projects that are deemed profitable can be financed. So this last point is very important, actually, because if you look at the recent, or the trajectory of renewable energy build-outs in the last, say, 10, 20 years, the wind and solar energy supply is definitely increasing quite radically, even exponentially, but it's not really displacing fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are also remaining at high levels of production and investment. So there's a problem there. We're not displacing fossil fuels. Okay, that's the intro, just to give some context. I suppose we'll just continue on. We won't pause here for Q&A, but I'll pause a bit later for Q&A, particularly after this section, because what we want to know is, what are carbon rewards? Referring to the novel Ministry for the Future, if you have read it, you might recall that the novel talks about carbon coin. So carbon coin is a new instrument that's used to fund mitigation globally, and it's supported by central banks. The actual policy, it's called carbon currency, XCC, and it has this unit of account. So the unit of account is incredibly important for any kind of policy or monetary system. It's 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent strategically mitigated for a 100-year duration. So strategically refers to the idea that this policy and instrument will only support projects that are really significant for the global carbon budget or carbon balance. So it means that not everything will be financed or funded with the currency. The 100-year duration is important because it's really talking about a planning horizon and contracts that will bind recipients over the long term. So we can manage carbon leakage from projects and so on. These long-term contracts, you might even call them evergreen contracts because they're going to roll forward for 100 years. Because you've got to keep that carbon stored in the ground or wherever it's stored. Clarification. This currency will represent greenhouse mitigation. It will be traded in forex markets. That's why it has this ticker XCC. It's not a medium of exchange, meaning that nobody will really be allowed to use it to buy and sell goods and services. If you want to use it to buy things, you need to trade it out into a local currency. So it won't compete with the US dollar and it won't be a geopolitical currency. It's not a carbon credit, meaning that although the unit of account is similar to a carbon credit, it won't be used for offsetting and it won't be traded in those markets. It'll have its own market and its own ledger without offsetting, and it's not a cryptocurrency. Now, the currency, it's an instrument, true, and if you give it to somebody or you earn it, what's it worth? Well, it doesn't actually tell you what it's worth. You have to compare it with something else. So if we compare the value of XCC to, say, the US dollar, what you're looking at is an exchange rate. So the carbon reward is actually an exchange rate. Just pick the currency you're interested in. The example is US dollars. So the exchange rate technically is US dollars per tonne of CO2 strategically mitigated for 100 years. Makes sense? What's unique about this currency-like instrument is that it's actually going to have a guaranteed long-term floor value. And I'll explain that a bit later. Now, the climate finance gap for 1.5, that's assuming we could potentially stay on 1.5. It also depends on technologies and the environment as well, not just the policy. But what we're missing roughly is about $3 trillion per year of extra targeted funding for conventional mitigation, meaning cleaner energy and decarbonisation of the various sectors of the economy. You could bump that up to $6 trillion if you want to include SDGs as well, but this policy is really focused on mitigation primarily. So that's the pink zone. I didn't actually explain what this chart is. I should do that first. So the vertical is annual emissions of greenhouse gases, horizontal years, and as you can see, we have CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases that are allowed to achieve, for example, 1.5 degrees. Now, the analyses from research institutions tell us that, for reasons of probability, even if we decarbonise at an extraordinarily fast rate, we would still need carbon removal. It's an inescapable problem. So the dark green is the carbon removal amount, and roughly speaking, that will cost about $1 trillion a year on average, just as a guess. So if we follow this pathway, which is hypothetical, we're supposed to achieve net zero CO2 by mid-century and then net zero greenhouse gases by, say, 2070. And where does the money come from? Well, what I argue is that we can use the carbon reward to fill that gap, and it is structured with 3 rules. So rule 1 helps finance cleaner energy. Rule 2 helps finance cleaner businesses of all kinds. It also includes public and private organisations. And then finally, rule 3 is this explicit price for carbon removal, or also called negative emissions technologies or carbon dioxide removal. It probably has other names too. So is that clear? Any questions here before I move on?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, how is the mitigation actually adding to the emissions? I would almost think that they would have a negative.
So this upper line here, the top of the blue, that's a kind of approximate business as usual where we don't have the policy. And so implementing this policy is supposed to clear out all of this so we don't have it. and then subtract this from the atmosphere. Is that okay?
Milo. Oh, wait.
Another question? Sure.
Yeah, just a quick question about the carbon removal piece. Given the fact that the way that we do some carbon removal now, it's sort of connected to fossil fuel infrastructure. How do you think about the sequencing of that? Are you thinking about carbon removal needs to happen now, or does it happen after we decarbonize because we're going to overshoot?
Yeah, short answer is we need to start now, and we need a long-term reliable price signal for the reason that we need a massive amount of money invested in R&D. If we invest huge amounts into R&D, it will lower the cost of mitigation and carbon removal over the long term. I'll also make one more comment. Rule 3, the way it's structured, it doesn't reward energy companies for carbon removal. And the reason is we want to keep those organisations separate, because you don't want to create a moral hazard where fossil fuel companies are burning and then removing. Fossil fuel companies can take it out of their chimney stack, but not out of the atmosphere to earn the reward.
Amber, did you have a question?
Yeah.
In that same vein of carbon removal, I work on direct air capture projects, and a big part of the financing model for those is a tax credit that Congress has. It's 45Q, where companies get like 180 USD per ton of carbon that's permanently sequestered, and they have to prove that it'll stay out of the atmosphere for X amount of years. Can you, I guess you were just talking about this, but how does that kind of compare to the model that you're proposing, and why you think your proposal is better?
Sure, I'll answer that quickly and we can cover it again later. So the short answer is it's a great policy, 45Q, as long as the government can afford to pay the subsidy in the long term to the levels of removal and storage that are needed. At some point, governments always have problems with their fiscal budgets, debts and so on. And when they see that there's an alternative funding mechanism, they might see the logic behind it, because this policy is self-funding. It doesn't incur any costs for the government on their fiscal budget. So they might swap out from 45Q into rewards over time. That's just my personal prediction.
We have another question.
So I understand the concept of being able to pin it to existing currency, right? And this might not be the appropriate question, but are there any detrimental effects that you could see out of a potential use case for currency arbitrage?
Currency arbitrage is allowed and it's encouraged, because I don't think it will impact the policy negatively. I think, this is my opinion, check it yourself, but I think currency traders continuously trading currencies for the arbitrage, and it might seem like a strange or dangerous thing, but I don't see why it would be a negative for the world economy, because really they're just capitalising on slight differences in exchange rates that are anomalous. Hopefully that answered the question, but if it's not a good enough answer, we could try again at the end. Shall I move forward, or one more?
Sorry, just one more.
Sure.
I might be jumping ahead, but is this also addressing not only mitigation but adaptation? Like, is there a quality factor in, for example, like biodiversity investments or ecosystem repair? I'm not sure how that would be measured.
Yes, I will cover that. In this presentation, we don't have time to go into depth into that, but maybe we can tease out the details with Q&A. So let's go there, yeah. We have another question at the back.
So earlier you briefly discussed the container ship sulfur emissions, and that when they stopped, it stopped seeding clouds, and how we've been basically doing geoengineering accidentally. That's something that I've looked into a little bit. It terrifies me. Do you think that geoengineering is like a viable channel, or do you think that the risks are too great?
That's the sort of question that usually comes at the very end of the whole, because it's those globally disruptive questions. I'll give you a short answer. Scientifically and objectively, I think we definitely should have solar radiation management on the table. We are by default doing it anyway.
Yeah.
We're just not consciously aware of it.
That's what's scary to me.
Yes. I'm not a specialist in that field, so don't listen to me, but the policy does interface quite well with that if it's needed. I think in this presentation and the time limit we have, we can't go down that rabbit hole. So let's talk after. Yeah. This is probably the most complex slide actually in the deck because it's asking you to understand the financial mechanism in terms of how it would impact society. It's the forcing function. And what it is, of course, it's the carbon reward, and as I said, it's the exchange rate. And the thick black line, that's called the floor price. So it's spanning 100 years and rolling forward. And the idea is that we need this floor price explicitly to encourage enough carbon dioxide removal to achieve our carbon budget target, our climate objective. Now, I mentioned rules 1, 2 and 3. 1 and 2 are for conventional mitigation. Rule 3 is for carbon removal. So this pricing chart is actually structured for 3, rule 3, the carbon removal only. And I'll talk about rules 1 and 2 a bit later, but let's focus on carbon removal. So we have analysts, a whole bunch of people who are very good at doing technical work, and they're going to figure out what the floor should be rolling forward 100 years. So that's our price signal, and this will encourage massive investment in R&D for that and scale it up globally. Now, when the currency is issued, it can then trade. So it's issued as a reward to fund the removal. When the reward is received, it can trade openly. When it does, it's going to have its own spot price, right, which is going to fluctuate under supply demand, but it can never fall below the floor. Why is that? Because that floor is enforced by central banks as a public finance guarantee, meaning that if the spot price were to fall below the floor, central banks will buy it up. That's central banks, all the major economies of the world, their central banks will buy it up. And how do they do that? Well, they just print more money digitally, which are called bank reserves. So we could talk about bank reserves and central banks, but that's the concept. Of course, there are more details about the instructions and the formula for it. But if we can assume central banks technically can do it and they have bottomless reserves of money which they can print, of course, inflation is always going to be an issue, but that I argue that can be managed. That's how we enforce the floor. And so this chart is actually hypothetical for the year 2045. So at 2045, looking backwards, we can see the spot price in red, and people alive at that time will see the forward price with a guaranteed period, which is maybe 15, 20 years, and that period is locked in, or that price signal is locked in. So managers of projects and their investors, they're confident that they can build out big projects, and they're confident they're going to earn the reward to fund it, finance it. Beyond that, there's forward guidance for the market, sort of signaling where it's headed. Okay, and that's the forcing function, because we'll use this price signal to manage the currency macroeconomically. And then for rules 1 and 2, which are conventional mitigation, cleaner energy, cleaner business, the way that's managed is with bespoke rules. So we use the same instrument, same carbon currency, but we have flexible pricing for those activities. Why? Because those markets are so complex with interactions and a lot of details down to the level of localities and individual projects. So that's it. We can come back to this later. Somebody asked a moment ago, what about biodiversity and those qualitative problems? Well, there are more rules to help address that. So I already mentioned rules 1, 2, and 3. There's rules 4, 5, and 6. These other rules, they're to adjust the rewards higher and lower to incentivize co-benefits. So one major area of co-benefits will be ecosystem health, which includes biodiversity and, clean water and whatever the issues happen to be to protect ecosystems. So the basic concept is, let's imagine we're rewarding carbon removal projects. It could be forestry or a variety of different things. Rule 6 will collect information from experts and it will propose to adjust the rewards higher if they're doing a good job, or low if they're doing not a good job or a bad job. Why? Because it will incentivize the investors and project managers to get it right for ecosystems so they can make a greater profit. So it's a price signal. And something similar will happen for community well-being and energy reliability. Another key point is that there's no carbon offsetting permitted in this market. And the reward rules are only for projects with significant additionality. So there's a significance test before they're even allowed to earn the reward.
Just a quick question. So conceptually, so I want to build a solar farm,
Mm-hmm.
3 miles from here. So I propose to the Federal Reserve this project, and they say, yeah, we'll give you this much in carbon tax, or in the global rewards.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically it, right? Or some
Not,
agencies set up that,
yeah.
not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is, no, so it's not, it comes from the government.
Mm.
I get to think, if it falls below a certain price, then I can cash it into the Federal Reserve. No, the Federal Reserve's buying these things to keep the price up above that.
Yeah,
Right, okay.
I'll talk about the financial mechanism in the next section. So what I haven't presented yet is how everything works as a kind of process, institutions and who does what. When that's clear, then this might make more sense. So at this point, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense.
Come on.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
in terms of like the quality aspect of it.
Mhm.
You mentioned like there would be an assembly of experts who decide who the people are,
Mhm.
and like is there a thought about like artificial intelligence being involved in that decision making?
Yeah, these are good questions. Maybe I should focus on this rule, because that's pretty topical. There will be a governance model set up with the peak institution, which I'll describe a bit later, and they will have guidelines for who could be experts for this. And it should include ecologists and ecosystem scientists and land carers, Indigenous people who have that intimate knowledge. So there'll be a qualification barrier before people are allowed in, and there'll be a platform that allows them to give their opinion and advice and votes for each bioregion or ecosystem. So it'll be very technocratic, and the inputs and outputs will be essentially quantitative, but in a qualitative context to adjust the reward rules. So if you need a strong signal, the governance model will have the ability to leverage up the signal if there's a lot of ecological problems, or tone it down if it's not an issue. So the short answer is it's going to be expert driven. Energy reliability, I think that can be very self-regulated, because people who work in energy, they have associations and institutions, and they can all join in as they can self-regulate. Community well-being, the stakeholders will be residents, and they will just pile into these platforms to give their information, what they want, to evaluate projects. So this presentation today, actually, I wasn't planning to talk about rules 4, 5, 6 very much because of time constraints. I was going to give more the foundation to the economics. So our policy working paper, at the very end, it does have these storylines which you can read, and that really will communicate the policy really quickly, because it talks about using the reward to swap out fossil fuel assets with renewables or sustainable cleaner energy. And this is an important concept. A gentleman asked about, does a solar farm earn rewards? Well, technically no, because if you build a solar farm, just say in the car park here, what's it going to do for the climate? Not much. It's probably just adding more energy to the grid, true? Maybe even it's kind of a rebound effect. So here, our main focus is going to be targeting fossil fuels we can't extract, because there's an over-planning for fossil fuels, maybe by 100%. So we're going to reverse auction fossil fuel reserves, particularly greenfield sites, and offer them rewards to buy out the lease with a contract that requires the recipient of the reward to use it to build substitute energy, which is cleaner. That's the model which is more relevant. Rule 2, you can read about it in the policy paper as an example of funding the retrofitting of buildings. That's a very complex part of the economy. It involves millions of buildings and it's a very complex ownership model. I'll talk about these at the end if we have time. So I'm just going to go through very quickly. Atmospheric carbon removal with algal farming, that's an example in the policy paper. So these just illustrate the utility of rules 1, 2 and 3. We can come back to it towards the end. Is that okay? Yeah. So I just want to summarise this section of the presentation with some key points about carbon rewards. Noting it's a new idea. It doesn't exist in textbooks. Economists aren't talking about it. I'll explain why in a moment, but carbon rewards will reduce offsetting and greenwashing. Why? Well, there's no offsetting needed because it's going to be fully funded. It will finance strategic mitigation. I mentioned that already. It's really focusing on the big ticket items. Carbon rewards will fund carbon removal. That's very important, the word fund, meaning fully fund. Because carbon removal, by and large, won't be profitable at all. It'll be a cost. We don't globally have a policy or a mechanism to fund it anywhere. Carbon rewards will establish long-term prices via the central bank backing. I talked about that. A reliable long-term price to mobilise a high inertia economic response. And carbon rewards will improve cooperation. Now, this is a really deep issue, complex topic. I tend to view the climate crisis in terms of a lack of cooperation over mitigation. And there is evidence that when you combine carrots, because the reward is a carrot, with sticks, it does maximise cooperation. Like the scientific experiments that have shown that to be the case. That deserves its own presentation. But we'll just move on because I'm keeping an eye on the time. We've still got we've got 35 minutes. This section, why use carbon rewards? Okay, so in this section, we're going to look at the theory, and I'm going to slow down a little bit here because I think theory is important, particularly at universities. So I have a statement to make about the market failure. So this is a hypothesis. You should be skeptical because that's the way science works. Healthy skepticism, not cynicism. The hypothesis is that the market failure in carbon is redefined as a special case because carbon is the primary carrier of energy for civilization. This has always been the case. Arthur C. Pigou, his economic theory for externalized costs is insufficient because Pigou did not account for the structural coupling between money and energy. I'll expand on that a bit soon. The critical issue is that the fiat money supply is mostly created through bank lending, that's commercial lending, which motivates market actors to undertake unsustainable profit-making and energy usage. So I'll talk about that if we have time, but most of our money, over 90%, is actually created by commercial banks as loans. Central banks only create maybe 3% as cash. In other words, most banks and private investors will support projects that are profitable, regardless of their carbon emissions, and are also unlikely to support carbon removal projects that are unprofitable. As I said earlier, they're going to be unprofitable. Standard taxes and other sticks also do not create cooperative feedback loops. And so my point is that we've got to think about feedback loops in terms of control system theory, and taxes, generally, people don't like them. So how do you create a positive feedback loop with something people don't like? These problems are structural and constitute a new type of externality called a systemic externality. So I'll expand on that, but I'm arguing that we're missing a type of externality that's not covered by Pigou. So a high-level view of money. This will help explain the hypothesis. So what you're looking at is the history of total energy usage by civilization from the 1800s. And as you would know, total energy consumption has increased dramatically particularly from the end of World War II, and it's comprised mainly of coal, oil and natural gas. Biomass has always been a major component of our energy supply. As I said earlier, carbon is a carrier of energy. And renewable electricity is fairly new. And the point I'm making here is that the way we use energy and develop money are correlated, although it might not be obvious. So historically, for most of our history as a civilization, going back to antiquity, the economies weren't growing and commodity money was quite practical because, as you can imagine, gold and silver coins, for example, they're in fairly limited supply, but it worked. Debts were also used to manage economies, but they were often cancelled. Why? Because the economies weren't growing. You can't sustain exponential growth of debt, compound interest, if the economy is not growing. So, interestingly, we transitioned more into representative money, particularly in the interwar period. The reasons for that are to do with sovereignty and politics of power. But certainly after World War II, Bretton Woods and the end of the gold window, what happened? Well, we transitioned into fiat as floating exchange rates, just decoupled from commodities. Why? Because fiat, you can provide it as much as you need. If people need more money, they can borrow it and commercial bank will simply create it for you. And the point I make is that this debt-based monetary system wouldn't be possible without the underlying energy supply. They correlate, in my opinion. So how do we maintain civilization if total energy peaks, which we probably have to, or even declines over the long term? Can we sustain this system with fiat? And the answer is actually a bit more complex than it might appear. I'll explain my answer a bit later, but the resolution hypothesis is that we need to complement standard policies with a new market price for managing systemic risk. So this is a key point. What I'm arguing is that Pigou prices costs, and I argue we need a price for risk, which is different to a cost. We could talk about that a bit if you like. This implies correcting systemic externality, which I defined previously, with a mitigate and trade policy called a carbon reward. I'll explain how this works a bit later. A new financial asset called a carbon currency will be used to provide the reward for strategically important greenhouse mitigation and stabilising the fast carbon cycle. The carbon currency will be underwritten by central banks to provide long-term price certainty, ensure financial scalability when incentivising market actors to mitigate. Radically improved cooperation is anticipated when this carrot and stick approach is implemented. Okay, you probably have a lot of questions, so I'll try and answer them. One way to understand this problem solution paradigm is with this systems diagram. And so what I argue is that the mainstream consumptive economy is the one we have now, and it's depicted on the left, that symbol. It obviously emits greenhouse gases, and we're locked in socially to high emissions. It uses mixed energy, that's fossil fuels and other sources, and it uses fiat money, which is mostly debt-based. And so this thing on the right is the new system that we're introducing with the carbon reward. Okay, I conceptualize it as a whole new system or subsystem that complements the first. Why a subsystem? Because it has its own currency type instrument. And this currency type instrument is debt-free, doesn't create new debt. And what's going on is that as we offer more rewards, we're effectively transferring energy and other resources into this parallel economy. Okay, so if you think of it in terms of a stock and flow diagram, stuff is going to move across, primarily energy and skilled labour, and the new activities are going to specialise in carbon removal and also helping to mitigate the first system. So it's going to pull in clean energy. The reason I believe this is really important as a system diagram is that it's significantly different to steady state, circular economy and other models. And it alludes to the notion of control system theory. So if you look at control systems, they generally structure like this with a governor in the middle. So the carbon reward mechanism is the governor for the stock and flow system. This topic in itself could be a whole presentation, so I'll just move forward. This might be a bit too technical for today, but the point about the two systems is that the vertical axis on this diagram represents how well we manage the first system with taxes and other conventional policies. That's typically focusing on sticks. So the horizontal axis is how we manage the new parallel economy, which is a carrot. And the point I'm making here with this 2D optimization and Pareto frontier is that it's a trade-off problem. Because if you have no carrots or very small carrots, you can go up here, right, to high efficiency. Or if you introduce carrots, you're going to sacrifice some resources in the mainstream economy, and you're going to try and target down here on the Pareto frontier. And my point is that we're at A, market failure, and if we take this 2D optimization approach, the solution to the market failure is to move from A, where we are now, to B on the Pareto frontier, and that's the optimum. So this is different to standard economics, because standard economics says we only have the vertical axis and the horizontal axis doesn't exist. So now you might begin to understand what I mean by the resource trade-off problem and the two systems solution. So how do we connect this to Pagu's theory and classical theory, neoclassical economics? Well, I'm going to show you the method I developed, and I'm going to compare it with the goods matrix just so you can understand the thinking. It's not about the goods matrix. I just want to show you the matrix of how it works. So you would have heard of private goods, club goods, common pool resources, and public goods, true? And so it's made up of these binary options, non-rival or rival, which is about whether physically you can provide the goods infinitely or there's limitation. Excludable, non-excludable is really more about the social constraints, whether people are excluded from it or not. So that's the goods matrix, true? It's pretty logical. And so what I'm saying is that we're missing a matrix for carbon pricing or pricing. And in this matrix, we have carrots and sticks. That's positive pricing or negative pricing, because it's got to be one or the other. And now I'm saying also the unit of account is got to be either fiat, that's standard money we use, or carbon units. Okay, so on the left column, we're looking at taxes and subsidies. So 45Q was mentioned before, that's a carbon subsidy. Carbon taxes are fairly straightforward. Now, if we use an instrument with carbon units, we've got to create a new instrument. And that's how we end up with cap and trade. So I'll explain this in the next slide. Coming back to the left column, it uses the theory of Arthur Pagu, pretty straightforward. Pagu's theory says you have negative externalities and positive externalities, or spillover costs and benefits. The climate problem is understood in terms of the social cost of carbon, which is the negative externality. Economists estimate it with complex models, integrated assessment models, and they come up with charts. And yes, it's a bit subjective, very subjective, but that's the concept. Generally, nobody talks about a positive externality for climate change. Okay, it's not really defined, so we'll skip that. But important is that if we use cap and trade instead of a tax, we might target the social cost of carbon, but now you've got your instrument, which is this emissions permit, true? And what happens, the government says, okay, you can emit so much to the polluters, we'll divide it up into permits, we'll give them away or auction them, and then the polluters can trade their permits under what's called the Coase theorem. You've probably heard of that too. So that's standard theory in neoclassical economics, but what's new? Well, if we follow the pricing matrix, we've got the carbon reward on the top right, the blue box, but it doesn't exist in textbooks. So what I argue is that in the matrix format, there are reasons to consider a new type of externality that balances the social cost of carbon, and I call it the risk cost of carbon. So what's interesting about this approach is that I'm invoking the Coase theorem again for our carbon currency, but I'm arguing that the externalized cost is not Pigouvian. I'm arguing we need to define another type of externalized cost, which is about the system. Okay? Pigou's theory explicitly talks about the behaviour of individual market actors. That's the Pigouvian externality, the cause-effect. I'm saying it's a different cause-effect with the monetary system and the economy itself is an actor. It's actually influencing people's decisions because we're restricted by the monetary system and the banking system. So if that is causing us to not transition to clean energy quickly enough or address the problems, then there's a problem. And so I call it the systemic externality. Okay? I don't know if you've seen these diagrams. Many of you probably have. These are the price quantity curves for the tax or the social cost of carbon on the left. The reason I'm showing you this is just to illustrate the formalization behind the approach. So we won't spend too much time on this, but the idea in Pigou's theory is that if you apply the tax, the optimal tax, it's called the social cost of carbon, you reduce the quantity of goods, so you'll have less pollution by taking into account the economic damages. So that's considered the optimum in classical theory. The economic damages have to be known and predictable, and you need to choose a discount rate. Now, in the literature, you'll find that there's a lot of confusion and controversy over both of those, the key inputs, particularly the discount rate. It's totally subjective. What's interesting about this approach with the risk cost is I argue it resolves these problems. Why? Because we have a new channel of pricing and we don't have to follow that approach. I argue the natural response is to price for risk at an institutional level. So we're not actually looking at social costs or benefits at all. We're looking at a systemic change. So we just need to figure out what the risk cost of carbon is. And I've already defined it, actually. That's the cost for the minimum amount of carbon removal. I know it's a little complex, but that's the answer. And that will shift the amount of carbon removal from risky, where we are now, to a new safe level. That's the risk cost of carbon. Now, the inputs are the average minimum cost of safe removal, and an institutional planning horizon. That's really important, actually, theoretically, because a planning horizon is simply 100 years or something like that, and there's no time discounting over that period. So we kind of resolve this debate over discounting, and we're addressing risks at a systemic level. Okay, the hard theoretical part's mostly over. We're just going to look at the pricing matrix again, the black box, but it's now couched in this table format simply to illustrate all the pricing options that include both voluntary and compliance. So this table is a reference table so that people such as ourselves can quickly understand all the options for pricing carbon, both voluntary markets, compliance markets, and carbon credits and offsetting. If you're new to this topic, you probably find it incredibly confusing. And the reason it's confusing is because of this, all these options. We won't go through it in detail here, but if you're interested, just come and talk to me. At a very high level, the highest level, my claim is that there are three major types of policies in the climate policy landscape. So on the left, you've got state actors, as you could imagine, governments, international agreements, fiscal spending, standards and laws, etc. In the middle, we've got our carbon markets. I've introduced the pricing matrix and the classification table. And then on the right, we have policies from non-state actors. I think people here think about ESG reporting and stuff like that. That's a non-state actor approach. You've got development banks, green loans, impact investing, philanthropy, climate bonds, divesting, reporting, collaborations, and so on. Excuse me. And that's basically it. That's the landscape. And so I'm just going to take a pause. We have 15 minutes before we go to the financial mechanism. Any questions?
These are all published in your papers, all these like graphs and tables and stuff?
No, it's only partly published, but the policy working paper has pretty much all of this in it, which is downloadable.
One of the pillars in that, is state actors. And I know that you were talking about central banks kind of issuing this instrument. What happens when political instability kicks in and state actors aren't reliable or collapse, or there's some kind of evolution in how that works?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So there is a line of thinking that says that policies that are held by central banks, mandates that are given to them, tend to be more stable than policies that are of a fiscal nature, because fiscal policies often change with change in government, Republican, Democrat, for example, whereas mandates of central banks tend to survive most election cycles. So the underlying argument is that the carbon reward here, it would actually be coupled to central bank policies and mandates, which you could argue is part of state actors, and there's that long-term coupling.
Did you consider maybe, like, I know someone mentioned AI in the sense of maybe creating a decentralized system that manages and sort of removes all of the emotional, political aspects of human life into, like, in order for it to be like an actual fair process and system that connects all of that?
Artificial intelligence, to be honest with you, I believe is going to be incredibly useful for a lot of technical work. I think, it is a brilliant tool for the mitigation assessments and analysing satellite data and everything like that. Also for searching for corruption in data, patterns of synthetic data. In terms of governance, I suspect it's mainly going to be human-driven by people without AI, because governance, I don't think we would allow an AI to take over our civilization somehow. So that's my opinion anyway. I'll take a couple more questions and then, because we only got 10 minutes, so we have a choice. We could continue the questions or go to the next section quickly. Keep going? Okay. Okay, financial mechanism. This is important to complete the context for the policy. I've already gone through this diagram, and just to remind you, that's the forcing function, the price signal with the floor backed by central banks to reward. How does it work? Well, you start with the issuer, right? It needs a name, so I call it the Carbon Exchange Authority. A new intergovernmental organisation, think IPCC or UN, something like that, and they have the right to create the XCC. And the way they do it is similar to the way banks manage loans. So in balance sheet accounting, you need an asset and a liability. Their liability is the XCC they issue to projects, the awardees, and the awardees will sign on to service level agreements. So that's a contract, a long-term contract. The analogy is a commercial bank that issues new fiat with a mortgage or loan contract. Okay, so the awardees are doing the good work, they've mitigated, they've done the validation and so on, and they've earned carbon currency. But what do they do with it? Well, they can't buy anything with it because it's just a financial asset. So when they want to buy something, looks like my computer doesn't want to move. Oh, there we go. They will trade their carbon currency for US dollars or euros or whatever they want in currency markets. Who will buy it? It's private traders, institutions, corporates, the general public, people who trade currencies. Noting that the currency market is the most liquid and largest in the world, trading 3 trillion per day on average. What happens if there's not enough demand? Well, that's when the central banks step in as the guarantors. So they will create new bank reserves, buy the carbon currency to lift the exchange rate back up, and they record the XCC on their balance sheet as their asset, and that's it. And that XCC just sits there in their balance sheet pretty much forever. So the demonstration, we're doing well now because I could probably get through this in 5 minutes with a few questions to follow. So the next stage of this project is to demonstrate. And so we're looking for strategic partners, policy centres, international non-governmental organisations, corporates and governments. We need a few governments to come on board. It'll be active research, so we'll be looking at role-playing exercises and scenario modelling. It's to do stakeholder mapping. We're going to interview stakeholders for the 6 rules, and we will do scenarios with their CEOs, if they're energy companies, with their financial planners, to get their opinion on the policy. Would it shift their decision making? They can also help to refine the policy. That's called stakeholder mapping. So we're not piloting anything. We'll also do policy assessments with central bankers and economists and lawyers, etc., to do the numerical validation. So that's where we're headed. Beyond that, the hope is that some countries will step up to pilot. Here I'll just go through some examples that we could run as scenarios, if you like, or do in the real world with the pilot. But rule 1, as you may know, there are oil, coal and gas reserves in tropical regions, particularly the Amazon, the Congo Basin has oil and gas around peat forests and so on. And we shouldn't be extracting that for 2 reasons. One, we can't burn it anyway, and we want to protect these bioregions because they're the last major rainforests and they store a lot of carbon. So what do? Well, conventional normative theory is that we blame the fossil fuel companies and blame the politicians. But here we say, well, that's not going to help. We need to buy them out. So we issue carbon currency enough that these owners of these reserves will sell them to the institution, Carbon Exchange Authority, in an agreement where they receive enough to compensate them for their lost profits. So it's a profit equivalent payment, plus a contract that says they have to use that money, or most of it, to build renewables in certain regions. Say, obviously, if the example's the Congo, it'd be in Africa. And with other clauses and conditions that they build a certain amount of distributed, decentralized energy and some utility energy. Okay, so that's the general theme. It's called an energy asset exchange. That's how we prevent the fossil fuels being mined. This is actually mentioned in the novel Ministry of the Future, but not in this level of detail. So, rule 2, the example of buildings. What we can do here is use bespoke formulas to offer a certain amount of reward in different cities and regions, and there's a wholesale price for mitigated carbon. Fiscal sponsors or businesses will set themselves up as consultants. they will operate a bit like mobile phone companies where they'll advertise for building owners to come to them. They'll offer them a retail reward if they decarbonise. Okay, so that's how we decentralise the decarbonisation of buildings. Difficult problem, very geographically sensitive economics. And so finally, the last example, this is also in the policy working paper, is the idea that we're definitely going to overshoot a safe carbon budget, so we're going to need carbon removal. I said earlier we need a global price signal that will mobilise a lot of investment and R&D, so that's what will happen. In this example, it's algal farming. So algal farming is a relatively new technology, but it offers hope because it uses seawater, it uses algae, and it can produce biomass that can be put in the soil, stored there, or to produce carbon neutral chemicals or even biofuel. The price could fall at scale, maybe getting as low as $60 a tonne. Okay, so that's very important in terms of the way the policy works. So thank you.